Hello and welcome. My name is Rebecca Rogan. I'm head of reference at Chappaqua Library, and with me today are the poets Myrna Goodman, Maxine Silverman, Meredith Trede, and Jennifer Wallace, all former editors of a little gem, Toadlily Press, which in its time published beautifully produced quartets of poetry right here in Chappaqua, New York. This program is in memory of the poet Jean Valentine, who passed away in December of 2020. And I would like to begin with a quote from Jean Valentine about all the poets who are here with me this morning. This is from the back of this book, Desire Path. And Jean said, "I admire the life force of Myrna Goodman's poems, both in her customary witty, high energy and her occasional quieter energy. I admire Maxine Silverman's pensive, spirited, musical lines. I cherish the wisdom of Meredith Trede's complex tracings of memory of her unspoiled evocations of these haunting lives, and I rest and wonder at Jennifer Wallace's still, almost painted reflections." So, today we're going to look back at the story of Toadlily Press, talk about how it began and how it shaped itself and the incredible work that you all did as editors to make it happen. It was very much loved. And we're going to hear some poems. Thank you to all of you. I know you're all going to read one of your poems. At the end, we're also going to have a poem which was published by you, by Jean Valentine, and we're going to have poems by some other poets that you published in Toadlily, including Pamela Hart, who is the author of the award-winning collection Mothers Over Nangarhar, a poem by Pushcart-winning poet Heidi Hart, and a poem by the former Washington State Poet Laureate Elizabeth Austin. So quite an accomplished group of poets. But I just wanted to start with my own personal little anecdote about Toadlily. So I work at Chappaqua Library. I've worked there for many years, and I was lucky enough to have an opportunity in 2015 to spend a year back in the UK, where I'm originally from. And I love poetry. I write poetry. I love to go to poetry readings, and of course I knew about Toadlily at that time. The word was out. People knew about the press. These books are beautifully produced, and everybody wanted to be in one of the Toadlily quartets. So the word was out there. So I was very proud that the press was based in my little town. So I was living in England, and I was looking for a place to go to a poetry reading, and there were some readings out and about. But I was told about a reading series that was based in a little town, Bradford-on-Avon, that was very close to where I was living, which is in the city of Bath. Bath is a beautiful Georgian town. Bradford-on-Avon was close. So I decided to go along by myself. And when I got there, I found that the series was run, and had been for years, by a poet whose name is Dawn Gorman. And she was very cool. The room was full of really interesting people, and I sat at the back and listened to people reading. And somewhere along the way, I think I picked up I was looking at Dawn had some work out on the table, and I was looking at her bio. And when I looked at her bio, she had been published by Toadlily Press. So I'm all the way across the ocean in this little English town. And the woman who's running, Dawn, who's this fabulous workshop, this poetry group leader, was published by Toadlily. And I was just like, I was so proud. So of course I had to go and talk to her after, and introduce myself and say, I know Toadlily, it's from my town. And anyway, so it was a wonderful little moment. And you guys, you had an international reach. This is a very, quite an accomplishment. Anyway, moving on, enough about me. So, Myrna, I'm going to start with you, if I may. So how did it all begin? What was the beginning of the story, the journey of Toadlily Press?
I'm going to answer that in a minute, but I just want to show you, this is the book that Dawn was in. This is the cover of the book. It was one of our last books, I think. Anyway, it was fate, actually, where we met, because the gods of poetry and the goddesses of poetry must have been thinking favorably on that day, because I had registered for a summer workshop in 1995 at Sarah Lawrence College. And I was a little intimidated because I was new at writing on paper. I was really a ceramic artist writing in clay. And but I thought I just wanted to study with Jean Valentine. So I got into the parking lot and I saw other people coming out of their cars with big envelopes and boxes and baskets and backpacks. And I thought, oh, I think I'm going to go home. I thought, I don't think I'm in the right place. But I pursued and went into the class, and then found out that Tom Lux was going to be my teacher. And I didn't want to study with Tom. I didn't know much about him, and I had known about Jean's poems. Anyway, make a long story short, he let me go into Jean's class. And in that class was Maxine Silverman and Jennifer Wallace. And it was a week's study of poems and reading other people's poems. And it was a wonderful time. And when it was over, Maxine and Jennifer and I wanted to continue. So we decided to meet once a month in each other's homes and critique our poems. And also we studied other people's more distinguished poets' work. We did some research and then talked and read their poems. And then a few years later, I was in another class at Sarah Lawrence and I met Meredith Trede. And Meredith was interested in joining the group and we were happy to have her. So that's how the four of us came together. I can tell you more, but maybe Maxine will talk about how we got our name and how we decided to publish and so forth. So unless you want me to say more.
Right, so that was the very beginning. So that was how you met.
Right. And how we decided after the 10 years of meeting that we wanted to celebrate our meeting. And how would we celebrate? Well, why not publish a book with our work in it?
What was that conversation like?
It was weird. I mean, Jennifer said the other day, we made something out of nothing, which is really what we did. It was very courageous. I mean, we knew that well-known poets had published themselves, but we really want to be published by other well-known presses, but we said, why not try it? And at that time, I don't think we thought we would publish anymore. At that point, we thought we'll just publish this book with 4 poets in one book, and that'll be a celebration. So we did that. And then maybe Maxine or one of the others can talk more about it. It was amazing that we got started and had this press.
So before Maxine jumps in, and Maxine, you're muted, by the way, but let's take this moment just to have our first poem. So Myrna, if you could read.
Yeah, okay. So this is from our first book, Desire Path. And I'll talk later about the cover and how we got that. So I'm going to read a poem called Kissing Ronnie Cossover. Kissing Ronnie Cossover. Boys liked her. They would ring the bell, ask if she could have a catch, play stickball, take a ride from Mrs. Wagner's pies. Later, she liked boys. She liked kissing them. David D and David B and Joe. But Ronnie, oh Ronnie, his lips were luscious, wet and plump and smelled of double bubble. Between kisses, he'd run his tongue over his lips in a circle, one way, then the other, the tip of his tongue touching his teeth. Then breathing hard, he'd pull her toward him for another kiss. Just another kiss. No hands in her pants, no jumping to bed, no massaging of ego or meeting the in-laws, no joint return or babysitter, no second mortgage. Hey, lady, you need a new roof. Just a 1940s old-fashioned, tongue in the mouth, oh my God, kiss. And I'll just tell you a quick little anecdote about this. So a few months after the poem was published, I got a phone call. And the minute I heard the voice, even though it was like 40 years later, I recognized it. And it was Ronnie. And the first thing he said was, you know, I could sue you. And I thought, well, why would you want to sue me? I'm saying nice things about you. And then he said, well, really, I'm calling to find out, did I really kiss that way? And by then I was a little bit annoyed. And I said, I don't remember. Anyway, my duty is not to the truth. My duty is to the poem, to make the poem sound good. And then I wanted to have a conversation with him, you know, to find out what he's doing, where he's living. And he hung up. And that was the end of Ronnie Cossover. But the poem lives on.
Hi, I'm Pamela Hart, and I'll read 8,000 Waves, which was published in The Fifth Voice. Each day, 8,000 waves roll in. That's 333 per hour. Nearly 6 waves breaking every minute, a meditation of water, like the faucet opened how often to wash plate and spoon or rinse pots. The spray of soap into grease stirs up such billowing as water breaks across the sink's back and spills into silver scrolls of foam. Outside the window above the sink, a blue jay for the umpteenth time elbows its way to the feeder while my hands dip in and out of suds, enthralled by replication, caught in steam on glass, the churn of surf against shore.
So Maxine, a question for you. So you met in a workshop. Did you know each other before the workshop?
No, not at all. We, among the, I think there were 10 or 12, I don't remember how many other people, but the 4 of us lived geographically close. So it would make sense. This was, you know, years before Zoom. It made sense that the 4 of us would gather. And it was a real collaboration, I want to say, just from the get-go. Often you hear about poets and infighting and competition. It's not all the rosy, world. But for us, there was this generosity of a real collaboration, and each of us wanting the other's poem to be just as good as it could possibly be. And you know, one of us, I think it was Jennifer, but I'm not really sure. I'll have to ask my sisters how it came about. But we would read our poem that we had brought to talk about, and then someone else in the group would read it for us so that we could hear our own work. And then we would get down to critiquing it, and it was just a marvelous experience for me, and it must have been for everybody because it lasted well over 10 years was when we decided to publish the first collection. And actually the name of the, I'm getting out of order, I guess, but the name of the collection, the first one was Desire Path. And I had a poem called Desire Path. And I liked the name, and I convinced the others it was a good title, but I didn't publish. I didn't include my poem Desire Path in my collection, because then it would make the collection seem too much that it came from my work. So in the spirit of the collaboration that had sort of fueled us all along, we named the first book that, but my chapbook did not include that poem. And going back to the name of the press,
Yeah.
my own work, whatever I was doing in my life, the poems would be generated by that. And at the time I was gardening very intensively, and came upon this small woodland plant that it looks like a tiny orchid. It's a beautiful little flower. And I proposed a whole bunch of names. I remember one was Sidecar. I remember one was Red Twizzler after the licorice. And then at the end I said, well, what about Toadlily? And my friends liked that one better. And it's not a particularly beautiful name, I guess, for a beautiful plant. It's a Japanese plant, actually, in origin. And they have a prettier word for it. It's Hototokiso, which means little cuckoo.
Oh, that's great.
But we were Toadlily Press.
Well, I just wanted to say I really always loved the name because it wasn't pretty, because it had that sort of, even the sound, you know, like toads are kind of, I mean, of course I love toads, but they're kind of homely, or they have warts, or they're, you know, kind of ground dwelling creatures. And lily, even the sound of it, it sounds angelic and kind of beautiful. And I always thought that juxtaposition, you know, seemed true to me, and could accommodate lots of different energies in the poem.
Right.
So I loved it for its non-prettiness.
And you found the line from Marianne Moore about the toads in the gardens. I can't recall it.
Line, boy.
Imaginary.
Oh, it's imaginary. Toads in imaginary gardens, or
Right. Real toads in imaginary gardens. But I also wanted to say that the logo, it's hard to see because it's so tiny. I think I might have a bigger picture of it. The logo was drawn by Jennifer's son. We tried to use a lot of our friends and relatives to do all the jobs that needed to be done to run a press. This is a little bit bigger picture of it over here. And can you all see it?
Oh, so that's a Toadlily.
And it's on the back of every book next to our name. And as an aside, to save money, because we didn't have very much money when we finally did more books, we used our friends and relatives to do a work for us pretty much gratis. I think we gave was it Brian?
Yeah, I think Dan, he got a little stipend.
He got a little stipend.
That was a huge, I mean, he was in high school, so.
It was a huge stipend.
His first commissioned artwork.
That's great.
I'm Elizabeth Austin, and I'll be reading It Didn't Happen That Way from Sightline. It wasn't a lure dangled by some fallen angel. She found it, mid-path, no tree nearby, unbruised, red-yellow round, sprung from the gravel. She entered the sweet fruit, wet flesh breaking on her tongue. She didn't ask for it, wasn't looking for it. No one tempted her, unless the apple itself, longing to be known, can be blamed for the light bent across its skin, for the midday heat transforming sugar to scent. And him? She didn't say a word to him. He found her, slack-jawed, skin flushed and damp as if he had lain on her, pressed into her. He found her, swallow by swallow, savoring the taste of knowledge, her eyes fixed, focused somewhere beyond him as if he no longer existed. And one more thing, she didn't tempt him. In fact, she never offered it. He pried the fruit from her hand, desperate to follow, and bit.
I wanted to add something about process because since we've dedicated this to Jean Valentine, that's the way Jean ran her seminars. Her workshops were just the same thing that we did. The writer read it, and then the next person read it too to hear. So in so many ways, we owe so much to Jean.
Yeah. And also, Jean, you know, Maxine, you're right when you talk about the atmosphere of the workshops and sort of the generous and the kindness and the focus being on making the poems the best they could be. I think maybe that was Jean's influence. You know, that's the way she was and the way she did things.
Yeah.
So I think that her spirit was and continues to be carried through, you know, even though we're not as Toadlily, I'm sure we carry that around with us in many things that we do.
Right. And it's still continuing out there. The people that you published who are now running their own workshops, you know,
There's
having
a story. It's not 100% related to our workshop, but I had the good fortune to work with Jean for a long time and assist her in some of her classes. And when she was ill, she asked me to take over. And I thought running the workshop was the hardest thing I had ever done. And afterwards I said, Jean, how do you do that? There's so, you know, you have the poem to pay attention to, you have the whole class's kind of mind to deal with, the individual poet, you're trying to grasp the poem at the same time. How in the world? And she said, well, I asked for it to be read a second time. And while it's being read, I say a little prayer. So there was a method to her method.
That's nice.
I love that.
Me too.
All right, let's take a moment to have our second poem, Maxine. If you could read to us.
Sure. The title of my chapbook is Red Delicious, and that's the poem I'm going to read. Red Delicious. The way my father eats an apple inspires, right down to the seeds he bites, a decisive, reflective crunch, turning the stem not to miss the littlest bit. We are sitting on the porch of my new house. As he eats, he admires the shade trees, touch the sky, oaks, mimosa, and beech, whose roots search out water beyond the edge of its shade. Now that was a good apple. He leans back. I describe how he polished the fruit off, how it looks to me, and he nods. Sweetest by the seeds. You could plant these. And he holds out the core. Nothing prettier than apples in bloom, except maybe maples in fall. He considers beauty, her varieties and form. He waves to John Curley. Yes, dear heart, here it is, handed to me once more. Savor, savor, plant the seeds.
So you decide that you're going to create this poetry, this book of poetry. So you have the idea, you're inspired. So Meredith, so what happens next? So to get beyond the idea into the actual practical nuts and bolts of creating a collection that is as beautifully produced as these are. You know, these were not, you were not running these off on a photocopier machine. These are really nicely done. And not only did you have to create them, but you had to choose a lot of poems by a lot of poets. Was that, did you get many manuscripts? Did you ever stay up till midnight wading through things? Did you all like the same poetry, the same poems? Was it easy? Was it challenging? How did that work?
Well, I'll start with the submission process itself. I mean, the first book, clearly it was us. So we chose things and we helped each other decide sometimes, I think, you know, which poems people thought would work the best, how to lay it out. We had done that together. To do the second book, first of all, we had to get the word out. And there was no email, right? So getting the word out, we had a Sarah Lawrence network because we'd all been through that in some way. And I had also gotten my MFA the same year that they started with Jean. I had started at Sarah Lawrence in '93. So getting the word out to get as much as you can get in. And what we asked for was everybody was going to be eventually publishing. Each chapbook would be 14 pages, which is what we had. So what we requested was each person to send in, that was submitted, to send in 16 to 18 pages of poetry, because you know you're going to have to whittle some. You want to be able to choose. And we requested 2 copies each. And these were literal copies. This was not, again, this wasn't email. This wasn't a word, so we had 2 copies of each one. When they came in, I think it was, they went to Myrna, who numbered them. So we had the first year, I think we had something like 80 to 90, I think, came in. And then what we did was we parceled them out to 2 readers. And we really started stressing that as we did the thing, because we knew from our own experience, when you submit something, if you just have 1 reader, you may or may not get through. It's going to be that individual's taste. But for us, we wanted to have 2 of us read every manuscript that came in, so that we could make some decisions and give some more variety. After we did this a couple of years, I know at some point, because I had been working, I was a management consultant, and I had been working on performance appraisals, and I was trying to come up with numbers. You all remember, I came up with a scale of 1 to 5 that we were going to use, so that we were just saying yeah or no. I don't think maybe you do remember, but anyway, we did it. And it was so like the highest one on the scale, maybe a 1 was, I would definitely publish this, it's terrific. A 5 was, I don't think this should be published. I mean, a lot of people have heart and they're trying, but it wasn't material that was ready to publish. Number 2 was close, but I'm not sure. Number 4 was, there were a few strong ones. And then of course, the number 3 was, I'm not sure which way it goes. So that we then have some kind of a immediate dialogue with each other. And yeah, sometimes it was difficult because we all write a little bit differently. We had different approaches, and the poetry that came in ranged from pretty experimental to some that were very much formal. And so we went back and forth with that in terms of an agreement. And so sometimes what we needed was a third reader who could come in and say what that person thought. Ultimately, we all looked at everything that came in that we decided we were going to use. And although each one of us would have, when there were the four of us, we were each going to edit one of the people that we chose. We also circulated that manuscript so that other people could check it. You know, were there things that we missed? Were there things that should be done or shouldn't done? And then we had to come up with the money to publish the books. So and then we started, I don't remember what year we started fundraising, maybe the second or third year. And I see Myrna nodding, so yeah. And again, we went out first thing, of course, to, you know, friends, family, people that we knew had money who might be able to, and we also started doing grants, writing grants, which was a challenge because they take a lot. And I can remember sitting with Myrna a number of times where we would go through the budget until we just thought we were going to lose our minds, because each time I would do a grant, they wanted something a little bit different, which is always the case. You couldn't always take boilerplate, and you always had to have the exact information that they wanted. And so what we ended up getting through, I don't know what the numbers were through the Friends fundraising, but we ended up getting almost $7,500 in grants from NISCA, of the New York State Council on the Arts, and from CLMP, the Council for Literary Magazine Publishing, is that right? And they were wonderful. I mean, the last grant, the biggest one we got, was $2,500, and Kathleen Masterson, who was heading up that grant money, they liked Toadlily. They liked what we did, and I had spent a lot of time down there talking to people, and she really helped us get the grant in.
My name is Heidi Hart, and I will read Dorsal from Edge by Edge. There are the doors in and out of the world, the white bed, the prison gate, the still pool deeper than it looks, the heart valve open or shut, the mine shaft, the stone rolled from the tomb. There are the doors of the body, the mouth that accepts the drink at last, the womb that lets in and lets out, the eyelid that lifts in recognition. There are the doors you see with an inner eye, the moment you pull up a flower and fear the ground has opened for you, the wind that enters your room and asks you to leave the life you know.
I wanted to say something about agreeing and not agreeing. I remember there was a time when Maxine had left, certain partners left as the press was continuing because they had to do their own work or for many different reasons. So Maxine left first, and then it was just Jennifer, Meredith, and I. And then Jennifer left, so it was Meredith and myself. And there was one year when Meredith and I had submissions come in, and we didn't like, we had very few submissions, and we didn't like anything that we had. So, so we didn't know what to do, and we didn't want to not publish. So we did the best of Toadlily in the middle of our 10 years. We didn't, usually a best of is done at the end. But that year, I forget what year it was, I'll tell you in a minute. It was 2011. We just didn't have a book. So we thought, it was Meredith's idea, let's do the best of Toadlily. And this was an interesting book because it was a poem that we had published in other books. Each one of our editors and each one of our poets would put one poem in, one old poem and one new poem. And then all the people that had done blurbs for us and all the people that had done introductions for us would also have a poem. So that's how we have Jean's poem, and you know, Tom Lux. We have VJ, we have Molly Peacock, and so forth in this book. So there are ways to get around things. And then when this book came out, it was very well received. So then the next year we got lots of submissions, and we didn't have, the problem again.
Yeah, well, it occurred to me while you were talking, Meredith, that in the same way that the press we were making something from nothing, each book also, it was because we were getting 4 poets in each book, and we could never predict what those aesthetics were or anything. There was impossible to preconceive some aesthetic of, well, this is the kind of book we publish. It always so organically came from the poets' energies of the individual poets that we selected. Although we did think about the whole at a certain point, but I think we really started at the micro level of, wow, these are killer poems.
Yeah.
So, it wasn't like we said, oh, we know that we publish only formal poems, or we publish only any kind of poems. It was always, whoa, what kind of book is this going to be this time? And that was both challenging, but fun and exciting.
Yeah, and one of the decisions was because of that, it was like, what sequence are we going to put these in? How do we let these talk to each other in some kind of fashion?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The idea as the quartet series proceeded, we even thought about the audience, and the conversation between the 4 poets, and how that might include in some way the audience. So it was a community. It was a collaborative effort that aimed for community.
If I could, I just wanted to read this first paragraph from Tom Lux, who was the head of the poetry program at Sarah Lawrence, who introduced Desire Path. So that was the first book and the origin of Quartet, which was really just because there were 4 of us. Tom says, what a good idea to gather chapbook-sized collections from 4 excellent poets and print them together as one book, 4 books for the price of 1. 4 different voices, each represented with a substantial number of poems. That was key. That's what made it different than an anthology. There were 14 poems, and very few anthologies, if any, would have 14 poems by an individual poet. So we might not have been sure any number of times that it was a good idea, but I remember rereading Tom's introduction a few times going, okay, well, if he thinks it's a good idea, I'm going to go with that.
Right.
Meredith, if I may, I would like to ask you to step in with your poem at this point.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to read a poem called The Hunger. My grandmother was from Ireland, and so a lot of what I write was informed by that. The only thing I think you need to know is that the words in here are lazy beds. It's the way potatoes are grown. They're in raised beds. And I guess also to know that this poem, he's not here, but I always tell my husband, I will let people know this is about my first husband, my first French husband, who was a charmer. So anyway, here it is. The Hunger. Newlywed and new to the kitchen, I make potatoes every night. Mashed, boiled, skin on or off, fried or roasted. No potato rotted in my cupboard. I scrubbed wherever dirt might lurk. I've learned how potato clumps in their lazy beds blackened, starving a million, sending the lucky to famine ships. Hatches battened between decks of the dying. My husband loved to mock the Irish of me. The 7-course dinner of 6-pack and a potato. He'd pretend to pomme de terre dauphine, but lived for instant quick-cooked flakes. He tried out new beds and pronounced mine cold. I burned rice, made glutinous noodles. In the bad years, landlords exported food while tenants starved. The righteous blamed the starving for the blight. Some say we're a feckless race. Some confuse person with potato.
So, Jennifer, I'd like to talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty of putting together a collection like this. The thought that goes into it, the editing process, and to all of you as we move on, as experienced editors, do you have advice for someone who is maybe sitting with their first collection or chapbook in front of them right now on a table ready to go? What would you say to them? What are some things that they should think about before they send that email out? Or I don't know if anybody sends anything out in a brown envelope anymore, but before they hit send. But let's start with some of the practicalities of editing a poetry collection.
So great question. And probably, you know, there's a lot of elements to running Toadlily Press, and there was a pretty, you know, pretty clear division of labor, but that also evolved from nothing. But we had certain responsibilities for the whole. But each of us was an editor of an individual collection. And that was just kind of a beautiful thing, because it gave, speaking for myself, it gave me the experience of thinking about the whole, but also thinking about the part and having this very close relationship with one of the poets. In fact, there's one, in the very next book after the one that we published of our own work with the fifth voice, one of the poets, the one that I worked with, he and I are still in communication with each other many times a year. You know, we check up on each other. We don't often even talk about poetry. I mean, he's just kind of a buddy now, you know. So there was just that overall experience, I think, was pleasurable for all of us. In terms of editing, you know, we picked the best work, and the manuscripts that we chose were already, you know, pretty well polished. They were pretty well had all their components in there. It was excellent work to start out with. So I would say the kind of work I did with the poets I worked with was more micro level, you know, seeing if I understood, if the punctuation seemed about right, and if the stanza breaks seemed like, okay, you know, I'm getting exactly what you're trying to convey. So I'll call that micro level kind of editing. All the other folks, you know, have their own experiences with it, I think. We got more poems from each poet than we would eventually choose. So we chose 14, and we had 16, so we could work with those poets to decide which goes in and which goes out. I don't know, others might want to weigh in at this point. I just found it totally pleasurable to work with individual poets. I had one who was in a subsequent book. She and I ended up at the same reading at the Baltimore Book Festival. She was in Virginia and I was in Baltimore, and we reconnected and hung out with each other. So, you know, some of these evolved into, you know, sort of, I would say, quasi-personal relationships. And, you know, that was also the spirit of that generosity and the atmosphere of friendship among poets that was really initiated in that first workshop.
Well, I wanted to say something about that, Jen. These poets also came, even though from different states, they came together for readings, and we got to actually meet them. It wasn't just, you know, writing back and forth or emailing back and forth. So that was another way we became friendly with them. And I know it's not the editing process, but it's interesting to know that when Maxine talked about making a community, I felt we really did make a community, because I too have, we had 36 poets that we published, and I'm still in touch with quite a few of them, knowing what they're doing. And, even, by the way, our intern, Tracy Brimhall, became a blurber for us. That's another interesting thing. Things happen. She was like a lowly intern at a book fair that we were at. And then it turns out we had to ask her if she would blurb one of our books. So things happen, as you go along in the 10 years. And I think Jennifer's right. It becomes a personal conversation, and it's lasting. Sorry to interrupt.
No interrupt. So, so what does it mean to send your best work? If we're talking about, things that we might offer to others who are ready to send work, one thing I think is in our own case, before our work made it into the first Desire Path, 3 or 4 other people looked at it. Not only did they look at it from the point of view of, do I understand what's going on in this poem? But, are grammatical issues there? Is it clear, clear how things are working in the poem from a punctuation standpoint? So I would say you're probably the least qualified person to decide if it's your best work. Lots of eyes and lots of other people maybe checking for lots of other things. I'm working with a good friend, published many poems, many books of poetry, whole anthologies, who's putting together a collected version of his own poetry. And he has 4 of us looking at these poems for all different reasons. Someone's just looking at punctuation. Someone's just looking at, is this section too fat? We all have specific assignments. And this is someone who's totally able to do this on his own, but he's not wanting to. He wants other people to catch his blind spots. So I think there's that. And lastly, before other people might want to weigh in on that, I'll say, follow the publisher's instructions. Because when you start getting hundreds of manuscripts, and there are very specific instructions, some of them want it in a binder, some of them want them stapled, some of them want your name on the top of each page, but when you have stacks and stacks and you get to one that's obviously not considered that, it just goes to the bottom of the read pile. I don't know if that was always our policy, but I know that's the policy if you apply for a Fulbright grant or an NEA fellowship. If you ignore that, it's not, it's basically sometimes not even read.
I've just got one little example. I don't know if I should say this, but it's always stuck with me, is that we had a submission and there was a note attached to the front of it saying, make sure you read this whole thing from front to back, because if you don't, you will not really appreciate the poetry. And I looked at that and I appreciate it. And that was the end of that, because imagine trying to edit somebody that's like this. It's like, of course I'm going to read your flipping manuscript. That's why I'm doing this. So just a thought of something to not do. Don't assume that you have something special that you need to tell an editor. As Jen said, follow the directions and then that's it. That's it. Just do what you're asked to do.
I would also say know the publication. If you're talking about submitting individual poems, look at what the publication likes. If there's a poet, if there's a magazine that only publishes experimental verse, maybe you don't want to send them your sonnets. Think about what eyes might be looking at that and what their intent is, because there are a lot of magazines, there are a lot of journals. Choose or you can even look at the editor. If that editor is a poet, him or herself, you might want to think, what would, of all your poems, where is that going? Where is that poem going and who's going to look at it?
I wanted to also get back to the punctuation business. We also had a professional proofreader who went over punctuation and really bad grammatical things that we might have missed. But before we hired somebody, we did a proofreading ourselves of the whole manuscript. And I remember the second book, I think it was The Fifth Voice, when it first came back from the printer, I was so excited. I was going out to dinner with a friend and I brought the book saying, look, this is our second book. And my friend turned it over to read the blurbs and she said, totally spelled wrong twice. And oh my God, so we had to, it was a disaster. He was trying to save money. I had to have the book shredded and we had to pay again for another printing. You know, so as careful as Jennifer said, you know, we are, and we're getting our best work, we ourselves have made mistakes. So it's best to have a professional, to do professional kind of work, you know, like book designing and so forth, because you can't be good at everything. And I think we wanted our poems to be the best and our product to end up being the best. So there were lots of challenges.
I have one other tip question, which someone gave, Tom Lux gave me this tip when at one point I was bemoaning the fact that I was sending work out and it wasn't really getting picked up by anybody. And he said, well, how many poems are you sending out at any one time? And I said, well, you know, I don't know. I probably send like 5 packets of 5. And he just laughed at me. He said, you should have like 20 or 25 envelopes of poems out at any one time, which of course means that you have to have a lot of poems written. But it's easier to do this now that most people are accepting things digitally. But, you know, he said, you know, follow the directions and try and send out to 20 different places. And I went, whoa, that's like at a scale that I'm not prepared to deal with. But I set that as a goal. And when I finally got around to that level, wouldn't you know it? You know, I mean, I just got work picked, you know, one after another. So take heart that the rejections, of which there are many, doesn't mean the poem isn't good. It could mean, you know, timing wasn't right, or could mean you didn't follow the directions. It could mean any number of other things, but if you have a whole lot out there, then the odds are just, you know, in your favor. And when the rejection comes in, you go, okay, well, I have this other journal in the queue ready to go. I'm going to send those to them. It also used to be the case that publishers frowned on making submissions of the same poem to multiple places, but no one's been able to keep up with the submissions. So almost all of them are happy to do that now, as long as you let them know if it's accepted somewhere else, which means that you have to keep track of that. But, you know, don't be shy, get your work out there, you know, try to get it into the hands of as many people as possible.
Back in the day when we actually sent out physical poems, I remember someone saying, if your poems come back, put them in a new envelope, you know, just keep them going, because you might have hit the wrong editor, like Jen said. Maybe it wasn't the day that editor was looking for a certain thing. You have to believe in your own work. Yes, you do need to make sure you're following the directions. And yes, please check your spelling. That's easier now than it was when we were making typos, you know. There was no spell check, but now you got it. So respect the work. Respect the work enough that you're sending it out, giving it its best chance.
This is called Hibiscus. Hibiscus. Sequestered in their wiry pods, the hibiscus opened last night after a long silence. While we mimicked stones in our shared bed, the big, lusty blooms burst into being, half human and full as the moon. We practice avoidance this morning, and a marriage of papery faces nods in the sun. Oxblood, pearl, and the pink-throated one, their enviable tongues already discovered by the bees.
So one thing we haven't really talked about very much yet is how you ended up choosing the particular images that you selected for the covers of your collections. And it's one of the most distinctive things. Every choice that you made I thought was fabulous. So how did they happen?
Well, I could start only to say that, our process, which was always evolving, did kind of settle into a rhythm where we would pick the title of the book, which would be its own process. And we had the great advantage of having one of the four of us be a visual artist. While we might have and did have definite affinity for visual art, one of us, Myrna, was a practicing visual artist. And so I think that was really a grounding influence on how things got moved from just, oh, what kind of cool image would there be, to generating the images, finding the artists. And maybe Myrna, you might want to talk a little bit about that from your perspective.
Yeah, well, the covers were thought about who would do the covers, and the first one was a funny thing that happened. My husband was an amateur photographer, and he called me on his way to work one day and said, "There's a red chair sitting in the driveway on our street," and it was pouring rain, and he couldn't stop to take a picture. He said, "Would you do me a favor and go outside and take a picture?" So reluctantly, I did go outside, and this chair from a desire path was sitting in a driveway, and there was a path. So I took the picture and we framed it. And one of our meetings to discuss what we would have for the cover for Desire Path took place in my house. And this photograph was on the wall, and everybody seemed to like it. And it had the interest of having the path. And I had taken not some classes, but had read some books and heard Chip Kidd, who was a very famous cover designer, talk about, what not to do or to do on a cover. You should never put, if your name of a book is an apple, don't put an apple on the cover. So we were very careful when we did our covers not to, for instance, edge by edge, not to put edges on the cover, to use different either photographs or paintings. And our idea also was to use the community. If we had a relative or one of our poets was good at art or photographing, we tried to use their covers. We tried to use their work for covers. For instance, in this book, Pam Hart, who's one of our poets, her husband, Steve Rago, took this photograph, and we used it. And then I did a little trick here with the little red letters spelled out the word words. So we tried to have fun with the covers as well as having it a community project. This book that Pam is actually in this photograph was done by Jennifer Wallace's friend, Linda Bills. And so forth and so forth. We tried to use colorful images, and our designer was very careful about putting the lettering in so that it matched the artwork. We felt the covers were as important as the work that was inside of it, because how do you pick a book if you don't know the author? When you see something in a bookshelf or in a bookstore, how do you pick it? Very often you pick it by the way the cover looks. So that was another thing we were interested in. And this is another one of an artwork that I had done of some sticks. And this was called a chord. And of course, there were lots of chords on there, but not exactly saying what we meant. So that was interesting. And then we also had to put lettering of who did the foreword of the book on the cover. So everything had to be placed just so. You might recognize a book by who did the foreword. And of course, the back was interesting too. We had the blurbers, and we sort of followed the colors of the front on the back, which is kind of typical. I don't know how well you can see that.
Didn't we have, I think we had, in the beginning, we would have graphic designers do the designs, but then eventually you took that over, right, Myrna?
I did take most of it over, but they had to do it into digital
Right.
form. I would send it to them, and they would have to put it in a file that the printer could understand. And I should mention that it was Liz Lester who did most of our designs at the end, and she did a great job. And I shouldn't forget Rachel Simon is one of our editors too. I have a whole list of people who helped us. We had a lot of great helpers, but I don't think, I'm sure I'll leave somebody out, so maybe I shouldn't mention any more.
Okay, but Myrna, we got to talk about just a smidge about the husband's auxiliary.
Yeah, talk about that, Maxine, definitely.
Okay, well, not only did Larry key up the first cover, but our husbands were very supportive. They came to every reading, and they would man the sales table, and generally talk up people in the audience as they came up to get their book and make sure they were signed and all those kinds of things and I think Brad, Meredith's husband, came up with the term, the husband's auxiliary. And we were very touched because I don't know, touch is not the right word, but at the time it was a big deal that our husbands were so supportive and so willing to take a back, not a back seat, but they were there for us all the way. That's so lovely in terms of community as well.
And Brad also loved lots of cases of wine every time we had wine. So I think that has to be noted.
Yes, we had several readings at the Chappaqua Library where we didn't have wine, I don't think. Maybe we did, I don't think so. But we did have readings at Poet's House where we consumed quite a lot of wine because people came in who didn't even know anything about Toadlily Press. But if there was a party around the neighborhood, they found out about it, and they would come up, and they wouldn't even listen to the reading, but they'd wait for the reception, and they could have the wine and cheese and all the other stuff we had. And another person that was so helpful with our press was Lee Brachetti at Poet's House. She allowed us to have our readings there several times, and she talked us up as much as possible.
We had our champions. We really did have our champions.
Yeah.
And on that note, we're going to end it here. I just want to thank all of you so much for doing this. It's been really fascinating. I'm really looking forward to putting this out there in April in Poetry Month and letting everybody have a chance to listen to you all, learn a little bit about the story of Toadlily. And I'm going to finish. So Meredith, you're going to read a poem by Jean Valentine, and I know she was a great friend to the press, and I think a friend to all of you as well, to some of you as well. And she died very recently. It's a big loss to the poetry community, and so yeah, please go ahead and read that poem. And thank you so much, everybody. This has really been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
La Chalupa, the boat. I am 20, drifting in La Chalupa, the blue boat painted with roses, white lilies. No, not drifting. I am poling my way into my life. It seems like another life. There were the walls of the mind. There were the cliffs of the mind. There were the 7 deaths and the 7 bread offerings. Still, there was still the little boat, La Chalupa. You built one, slowly, in the yard after school. Thank you, Jean.